I think Spider-Man 3 gets talked about the wrong way. Most people remember Venom, the black suit, the dancing scene, all of that, but every time I rewatch this trilogy, I don't really see Venom as the problem. I don't even see Peter as the center of the story anymore. I see Harry Osborn, and I don't think he's a villain. I think he's something worse. He's what happens when grief never resolves. It just changes shape. Harry doesn't become a villain in Spider-Man 3. That's the misconception. His downfall starts way earlier. It starts the moment his father dies. Because after Norman Osborn is gone, Harry doesn't get closure. He gets silence. And in that silence, something starts building. Not anger at first, confusion, then obsession, then certainty. Because when you don't get answers, you start creating your own. In Spider-Man 2, Harry is already unstable, but it's subtle. He's not explosive yet, he's isolated, frustrated, clinging to something he can't fully understand. His father is gone, but Spider-Man is still there. So in Harry's mind, the connection is simple. Too simple. Spider-Man has answers. Peter knows him. Peter is hiding something, and that something becomes everything. And what makes Harry so interesting in this stage is that he's not wrong to feel something is off. He's just wrong about what it is. Because grief doesn't care about accuracy, it just needs direction, and Harry gives it one. Peter, Spider-Man, betrayal. That becomes his emotional structure. But here's what's important. Harry doesn't start as someone who wants to hurt people. He starts as someone who wants truth. He wants clarity. He wants his father back in some form that makes sense. But the problem is, Spider-Man 2 doesn't give him that, and neither does Peter. So that unanswered emotional pressure doesn't disappear. It builds, quietly, in the background of every interaction, until it stops feeling like grief and starts feeling like purpose. By the time we reach Spider-Man 3, Harry isn't becoming something new. He's just finally acting on something that's been inside him this whole time. And that's what makes his arc feel unsettling, because it doesn't feel like a transformation. It feels like exposure, like something that was always there, finally reaching the surface. When Harry becomes the new Goblin, it's easy to frame it as a villain turn, but that's not really what it is. It's a coping mechanism, a version of himself that doesn't have to feel the weight of unanswered questions anymore. Because in the mask, there is no uncertainty, only direction, only action, only revenge. And this is where Harry becomes a mirror. Because if Peter Parker's story is about responsibility, Harry's story is about what happens when responsibility is replaced with obsession. Peter absorbs pain and keeps moving forward. Harry absorbs pain and redirects it outwards. Same source, different outcome. And the tragedy is, Harry never stops being Peter's friend. That's what makes it worse. Because underneath everything, there's still a part of him that remembers who Peter is, that remembers what they had before everything collapsed. But grief doesn't erase those memories. It just buries them under everything else. And the deeper Harry falls, the more you realize something uncomfortable. He's not being manipulated. He's not being controlled. He's just following a path that feels emotionally correct to him. Even if it's wrong, even if it's destructive, even if it leads nowhere good. Because grief doesn't care about outcomes. It only cares about expression. And that's why the Goblin persona matters. It's not just a mask, it's permission. Permission to stop asking questions. Permission to stop hurting silently. Permission to turn confusion into action, even if that action destroys everything around him. But what makes Harry's story tragic instead of just dark is that there are moments where he almost comes back. Moments where you can see the version of him that could have existed if things had gone differently, if he had gotten the answers sooner, if he had spoken instead of spiraling inwards, if Peter had known what was happening inside of him. But Spider-Man 3 isn't a story about if, it's a story about too late. And that's what makes his final choice hit differently, because by the time everything reaches its end, Harry isn't really fighting Peter anymore. He's fighting everything he's been carrying since the beginning, all the unanswered questions, all the resentment, all the confusion he never had language for. It all comes out at once, and like most things built on silence, it collapses under its own weight. And when you step back and look at the trilogy as a whole, Harry Osborn becomes something bigger than a subplot. He becomes a second tragedy running parallel to Peter's story. Peter's arc is about learning responsibility. Harry's arc is about what happens when responsibility never gets clarity. Peter becomes Spider-Man. Harry becomes shaped by Spider-Man. Not because of heroism, not because of absence, but because of misunderstanding, because of grief that never got resolved early enough to matter. And I think that's why this character hits harder now than he used to, because as you get older, you realize how many people don't fall apart at once. They fall apart slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing until it's too late to fix anything cleanly. Harry isn't a comic book villain. He's just what unresolved emotion looks like when it finally stops staying inside. And maybe that's why Spider-Man 3 feels so chaotic, because underneath all the spectacle, there's a character study happening that never really stops. Even when the movie shifts focus, even when other villains enter the story, Harry is still there, still moving, still breaking. And if Spider-Man 2 is about failure, then Harry's story is about what happens when failure doesn't get addressed. It just evolves. It becomes identity. And I think that's the part of this trilogy people overlook the most. Peter Parker becomes Spider-Man because of one moment. Harry Osborn becomes something else because of everything that didn't get resolved over time. And these are two very different kinds of stories, but they're happening in the same world at the same time. Maybe that's why Spider-Man 3 feels so heavy underneath everything else, because it's not just a superhero movie with too many ideas. It's just a story about what happens when emotional threads are left open for too long, and people are forced to live inside them. And Harry Osborn, he's the clearest example of that. Not a villain, not a monster, just a person who never got what he needed early enough to matter. And by the time everything reaches its end, there's nothing left to become except what he already is. And maybe that's the real tragedy of Harry Osborn. Not that he became something dark, but that he never really had a chance to become anything else. Because the truth is, Harry Osborn isn't an exception in superhero stories. He's just one of the clearest examples of what happens when emotion has nowhere to go, when it doesn't get answered early enough, when it doesn't get understood in time, when it just keeps building and everything turns into something else entirely. And I think that's why I keep coming back to these older Marvel movies. Not because they're nostalgic, but because they still feel like they were written around people first. Even when things fell apart, even when things get messy, there's still something grounded underneath, something emotional, something human. But the thing is, Marvel didn't stay like that, not fully. It started shifting, expanding, getting louder, more self-aware, more unstable. And that's where things start to change, because not every character in Marvel falls apart like Harry Osborn. Some characters embrace the chaos instead. And I think the clearest example of that shift is a character who knows exactly what kind of story he's in and refuses to behave in it. So next time, I want to talk about something very different. Not emotional collapse, not quiet tragedy, but something a lot more unstable. A story that feels like it's constantly aware it's being watched. A story that breaks its own rules on purpose, and somehow still works anyway.
Deadpool and Wolverine just fucking shit up.
I want to talk about Deadpool and Wolverine, and why it might be the most honest mess Marvel has made in years. Because if Harry Osborn is what happens when emotion builds in silence, Deadpool is what happens when nothing is allowed to stay silent at all. And Wolverine, he's the only thing holding chaos together. Barely. And that's where the next story begins. Not with grief, but with chaos that knows exactly what it is.
Yeah.